The Goldenrod Protocols by James Oliver, copyright 2023.
By the time he got to high school, they'd stopped being so whimsical about it. You must stop thinking of yourself, they said. Everyone was part of something much more important and even more beautiful. If even one person abdicates their responsibilities, it will die and everyone will suffer. But it was a good thing, because it gave you a purpose you'd never have had otherwise, and no one would ever be left out. Everyone was just as special as everyone else. His father used to play poker with his friends at the kitchen table, and they'd talk about what was happening to their world. "They're rewriting the dictionary," he once heard his father say while he walked past the poker table to get a snack from the cabinet. "They're changing what words mean to control how you think. The thing I can't believe is no one even notices." "Let me tell you something, Johnny," his father's friend Donnie said. Donnie was older and fluid in shape. His words were labored, choked out from his chronically congested lungs. "My kid showed me what objection, as in, I object, means the other day," it said. Donnie paused to think, and all Jack could remember from after that was, "An act of violence used to undermine the better way. Violence, Johnny." It said, "Violence." "Of course, Donnie," Jack's father replied. Big John Caulder was always the smartest guy at the table. Everyone listened intently as he explained definitions, call something by a terrible name and no one wants to touch it. They updated the dictionary so it was official. No one even remembers what it used to mean. But what good are words if you can just change the meaning? Then they don't mean anything. "They're no good to me or you," Big John told him. "They're only useful for changing how people like me and you think." He'd turned to Jack as he was leaving the kitchen. "Remember, Jacko," he said, "shit by any other name would still stink. Innocuous words became bad words. Bad words became good words. Some words were banned because the sound of them put lives at risk. According to the treaty, the rebellion couldn't imprison people for objecting to edicts, but the abbeys were allowed to add the word violence to the definition of objection, so people were afraid to do it. Object meant dissent, after all. Friend meant supporter. Fun was a form of service. Most occurrences of help had been absorbed into patronize, and so forth. While everyone who'd sculpted a version of themselves to fit some space in the corporate machine knelt in deference to the better way, those who'd always been happy with low profiles and simple lives were laughing at them. They sat around bars and poker games and bowling alleys mocking the new rules and new words by purposely mispronouncing things, joking that the correct pronunciations were forbidden. "Barbecue at my house on Sunday," one would say. "You can't say house anymore," another would shout. "It's your whose." And all would have a laugh. They played with the dictionary, too. House became whose, man became mon, and dog became doag. Sometimes their own new words took on real meanings. A mon was a man who devoted himself to the better way. He had a deek and a pair of bales. Whoses were where men lived. And like canines, dogs were good boys and girls who always did what they were told and believed what they were supposed to, without the higher cognition to determine its merits for themselves. Doag, mon, whose. These words were the only living remnants of free thinkers and free spirits like Jack's father. They hadn't crossed his ears in years, and he often used them in his thoughts to keep his father and the world he came from alive. But they and their essence lived only in his mind, and he sometimes wondered whether he'd been a faithful steward. What did they ever mean if he couldn't trust his memory? Jack used to think doags were the same thing as Czechs, but the more he eavesdropped on the progs, the more he understood the distinction. Czechs were truly devoted. They were the professionals with profiles on town square. Whether because they believed or because they were under watch, Czechs had something at stake. For Czechs, devotion to the better way was an all-encompassing way of life. It was trendy. It was intentional, purposeful. They repeated the mantras not to make a point, but to make sure others heard them repeating them. Most Czechs believed they believed what they believed because it was right. But for some, like Jack, it was really because they were afraid not to. Doags were simpler. They lived inside the ecosystem but weren't part of it. There was no advantage for them to believe, and no danger not to. They simply ate whatever doagma they were fed for no other reason than there had never been anything else to eat. Czechs cheered the devoted because they too were devoted. Doags cheered them just because. If it weren't for devotion, they'd cheer for something else. Czechs scrambled to adopt the abbey's edicts. Doags mindlessly scarfed up the leftovers that dropped to the floor. Czechs were the masters and doags were their pets. Some checks were also doags, like the news-parroting checks from Town Square that morning. So completely surrounded by devotion, it never occurred to them to question it. But not all doags were checks. Some, Jack mused, were even progs. Tom was no check, but he was definitely a doag. He never considered what he was saying enough to believe it. He simply repeated, "Tom, what are you talking about? You got a good job, a nice place to live, a beautiful wife. You're pretty lucky. Used to be, not everyone had those things before the algorithm. There are people in the fronts who still don't." Tom had never even met Jack's wife. How do you know she's beautiful? She was, of course, but he had no way of knowing. Tom's words were insipid. True, Jack would never have to worry about being homeless, but his apartment wasn't a nice place to live. It felt more like a pen than a home. There was nothing all that good about his job. Tom's point almost made sense if you didn't think about it for too long. If you were a doag. "Tom, if everyone has a job and a home, then how am I lucky to have them?" Jack snipped back as his coffee finished brewing. He carefully retrieved it from the tray and walked toward a chair next to the plastic table and sat. Tom didn't hear him. He was immune to anything that wasn't doagma. "You see what I mean? Never satisfied. Never grateful. I feel sorry for people like you." There was no point in trying. Someone like Tom couldn't comprehend what it meant to yearn for more. To feel that his life had been commandeered. What was so great about a miserable job, an uncomfortable home, and a stale marriage? What's so special about having things I don't want? Tom shook his head. "You need a vacation," he suggested as he walked toward the door, unwrapping his treat. "Be tame." Jack rolled his eyes. "Be tame, Tom," he begrudged. He was free while he was talking to Tom, but the price he often paid was to be faced with the inescapable truth that there was no undiscovered corner of the world where he'd feel at peace. He'd always known deep in his bones that something in the air around him was wrong, but he couldn't pin it. He'd only ever heard things that didn't sound right, nothing sensible he could anchor himself to. His life was lived in a boat lost at sea on a dark, moonless night, searching in vain for something to guide him to the shore. He watched the ghostly wisps of vapor flee the tiny oval opening in the pure white lid. He envied them as they danced in the air, finally free from the stifling constraints of the cup. They were far more interesting than listening to Tom parrot the same meaningless platitudes Jack had heard for more everydays than he cared to remember. Nothing was gained. Nothing was learned. What must it be like to be as simple as Tom, perfectly content with whatever life handed him? Never having an original thought? There has to be more to life than this, Jack pondered as he sucked a tiny, careful sip of coffee. Jack watched the new recruits from the control room above them. They sat at ancient computers in 4 rows of 3 next to the belt motor housing on the production floor, playing training games to assess and refine skills they'd never need in the jobs they were training for. It was 4:52, over 2 hours left. He tried once more to imagine this was something else. Maybe the trainees were officers on a submarine near the fronts analyzing sonar readings. Maybe they were suspects in a crime and the computers were taking statements while monitoring vitals, anything other than his reality as it was. There was nothing sexy or thrilling he could pretend he was doing, no adventure he could convince himself he was living. But he kept trying, harder and harder, to find something. The trainees reminded him of himself 15 years before, excited to start his life and work his way up the ladder, excited to be somebody. Now, he found himself embarrassed by the memories of expectations no one even knew he had. He saw his younger self through the window and desperately wondered what life might have been if only he could run down the stairs to the factory floor and warn himself of what lay ahead. How could I have been so foolish? He closed his eyes to escape the shame. One of the trainees stumbled out of his chair and up the stairs to the control room. "Excuse me, Mr. Caulder." "I ask but do not expect your forgiveness, but I have a question," the trainee asked. Great care was always taken when asking a question of a stranger. Just ask the fucking question. Jack took a deep, calming breath, quietly so as not to arouse suspicion. This guy didn't look like a true believer, but you never knew. "Yes." Jack stopped short. He couldn't remember the guy's name. Jim? Something with a J. "I'm not feeling well. Can I come back and take the test on Monday?" "Sure," Jack told him. "I'll have my manager reschedule. Go get some rest." The permission wasn't his to give, but whatever consequences he'd face were negligible next to the rush of pretending it was. But he was also disgusted by his own irreverence. Thank you, Mr. Calden, and praise to you. I was not entitled to an answer to my question. This was the penance for power. Questions implicitly demanded answers, which made them a form of coercion, bending the will of others to deliver the answer you sought, which in turn made them an act of violence. Acknowledging this violence negated it. Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Mr. Calden, replied the trainee. Before he left, he turned to Jack and said, Be tame. Be tame. The moment was ruined. Jack was nauseous and too annoyed to bask in the petty thrill. He heard a chime and checked his link to find dozens of replies to his town square comment. He tapped the first and braced for the onslaught from the hollowheads. His heart raced and his forehead dampened. He tapped text only. He couldn't stand the idea of hearing their voices. His comment was pinned at the top. I'm not an allegiant, but didn't Machenbaum warn that thousands would die if we sent ground troops? 73 X's and only 4 checks appeared. An unenviable ratio. Shamed. The display was a warning. Too many comments like this and he would be in trouble. But luck was on his side today. 77 reactions wasn't enough to catch anyone's attention. He tapped play. The replies scrolled. So you think they should just keep bombing schools forever? Forced laughter. Alexander McHenry, Southwest Great Lakes Metro Center. Jack's guts churned. He hated his job, but he'd gotten used to it. At work, only his body was trapped. But there was a much deeper isolation in a simple thought he couldn't get across, like he was a ghost invisible to the living. You mean like the president kills children? Yvette Morin, Brossard, Metro de la Vallée du Saint-Laurent. You allegiants have no morals. Jerome Chambers, Holly Springs, Golden Triangle Metro. Jack took a breath. Aggie, Amy Smith, Bailey's Crossroads, Potomac Metro. He'd had enough. There was nothing he could do but lean on his desk and rub his eyes. He stared at the empty seat in the testing area, envying the trainee who'd left. I bet he wasn't even sick, he mused aloud. I wish I could leave. But he could. And as he pictured the trainee meeting a girl for a drink and laughing and making memories without a thought to what he'd left behind, he began to realize it. The machines are off for the day. The trainees were on camera, but I'm not. Once they'd finished the games, they were free to leave. They don't even need to sign out. Even if they could cheat, it would never matter.